Okay, welcome to the Jackson Hole China Forum. This is the first one for this quarter. This is the second, the first week. The first week of the winter quarter, and I'm so glad that we have a very good speaker, very dear friend from far away. When I say far away, meaning that he literally travels from China. Although he is a professor and director of China Studies at Duke University, but he's also dean of the School of Arts and Humanities at Jiao Tong University in Shanghai. So he has 2 appointments. Most of his time, his wife is here too, by the way, so that's important. And so his wife is also from China. Just happened when we scheduled this, her wife was still in China. Then her wife said, I'll be in US for a few days. So they come together. And her wife is also running a big kindergarten in China. Is the president of the kindergarten. But Professor Liu is spending, I think, 60 or 70% of the time in China.
More or less.
More or less. And so that's a new development in China. You can tell they try to attract talents from US. So he's one of the Chinese called 千人计划, the 1,000 talents. You remember some time ago we had a speaker, Wang Huiyao. He came talk about those talent search program. They try to recruit 1,000 top talents from all over the world to work in China at certain capacities. So Professor Liu is one of them. They recruited from the US to run a school in China. In the meantime, he keeps his professorship at Duke University. In fact, he's also running a center there at Duke on China Studies. Professor Liu is a very established scholar of Chinese literature, Chinese society, Chinese culture, and Chinese media. And he graduated from Nanjing University in China, then came to, you were in Nanjing University?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
I used to teach there.
That was not the time before you were even born. And
Otherwise, it would have become my teacher.
And he came to the US in 1983. That was one of the very first groups of the Chinese scholars, students came to the US and received his PhD from University of Wisconsin in Madison, which is also a very beautiful campus. Then has been taught at Penn State University for quite a while. From there, he moved to another very beautiful campus called Duke University. And Professor Liu has published a lot of academic books, but he's very well known in China because of one of the bestsellers in 1990s, that book. How many people heard that book? This behind the scene of demonizing China. You heard? Okay, quite a few. No? Okay, someone heard that. In 1990s at that time, when there was a very first wave of nationalism after the end of the Cold War in China. So people in China try to understand how the China's image in the world and how China was treated by other nations. So he and his co-authors, that book was called 10 People, I think. And 2 leading co-authors, himself, another professor at Tsinghua University. At that time, he was a reporter for Xinhua News Agency. So they put together that book, How American Media Perceived China. So that book became bestseller. I don't know how much money he made. Okay, you had more to in the hand. Yes. 妖魔化中国的背后. You heard that book? Yeah. It's a very famous book in China. So without further ado, let me turn the floor to Professor Liu. Please join me to welcome Professor Liu.
Good afternoon. Thank you, my dear brother Sixing. I'm very happy to be here. I remember the first time I was at Denver, Colorado. I was like more than 20 years ago. I came to Boulder, Colorado for a job interview, and I stopped at Denver for a day or so. I was really struck by the beautiful downtown. You really had a pedestrian area to walk. And I also feel very touched. This Friday afternoon with so many audience coming. It's Friday afternoon. We're expecting a dinner party, right? When you come to here for me to talk about this dinner party, better go home and enjoy the dinner party. So I try to be very short, very brief. The dinner party of discourse owners. This may strike me odd. Because we talk about the owners of a house, owner of a discourse. What does it mean? Now here we go. Actually, I was just finished this paper yesterday before I boarded the airplane. Trying to have a little sketch of the contemporary Chinese intellectual scene. As a sequel to my paper, which is going to be published by the Journal of Contemporary China. That paper is also on the Chinese intellectuals in Chinese contemporary culture. I had a conversation with Shui Sheng's capable assistant, Donna, today, asking me to add something about the paper scheduled to appear in the journal. I said, if I want to add something, I will have to add the whole paper. So maybe I just forget that, but let me talk about this to a very distinguished audience here. Again, I really want to thank you for sharing with me some interesting stories. Actually, I prepared this PowerPoint this morning. I was struggling with myself whether or not I want to add a few images and pictures. I really usually give in presentations with a lot of images. Just add some color, make it more real, so to speak. We have all the people, because I'm going to talk about a lot of people, a lot of individuals. I'm going to name names, unfortunately. Some of the people are. Most of the names I've named are very well known in China. Some of them are good colleagues or even friends, so I don't really want to offend them, so I'd rather talk about the ideas, all right, instead of the people. So my presentation won't show any images or pictures of them. Instead, I try to say something about the ideas. Their ideas and ideas that are more anonymous. Without much ado, I want to go right away to the whole thing of dinner party. This really starts with a quote from 1927 by Chairman Mao, great leader Chairman Mao. Chairman Mao said, "Revolution is not a dinner party, or writing an essay, or painting a picture, or doing embroidery. It cannot be so refined, so leisurely and gentle, so temperate, kind, courteous, restrained, and magnanimous. A revolution is an insurrection, an act of violence, for which one class overthrows another." Shui Sheng and I remember this very vividly when we were little red guards or small little red guards during the Cultural Revolution. Because this was made into a song chanted by millions and millions of red guards at that time. And most of these red guards grew up, like Shui Sheng and I, we were not really red guards, but we'll talk about it later. Most of the red guards grew up. Some of them become the names into my discussion, namely the discourse owners, i.e. the contemporary Chinese intellectuals. Let me say very briefly about China, contemporary China now, or post-revolutionary China. for the government, the CCP or Chinese Communist Party, the most important objective is to maintain stability. So revolution is a scary word. So when we try to cite Chairman Mao again, it really strikes one as both anachronism and oxymoron, because I'm going to talk about the oxymorons aspect of that, because for Chairman Mao, revolution is not simply the violence, but also writing essays and dinner parties. And right now, apart from the maintaining stability, the Chinese party and the state, or party state, is trying very hard to promote Chinese soft power. Soft power, discourse power, in Chinese called 话语权, or discourse power, at dinner parties. Without dinner parties, you won't be able to promote your soft power and discourse power. By the way, when I ask my students at Duke to present their research on the Chinese soft power, quite a few of my Duke students identify Chinese food as the most important soft power, which I believe is true. But anyway, in China, we still pay a great deal of tribute to Chairman Mao, or whatever we call the banner of Mao. According to the Chinese architect for reform, or 改革开放 Deng Xiaoping, we still cannot abandon the banner of Mao. Somehow this banner of Mao remains an ambiguous and ambivalent icon since the 改革开放. The rhetoric of Mao and communist ideology and so on and so forth somehow remains a legitimating rhetoric, but increasingly has become a liability for China now. Mao's ideology of egalitarianism and idealism is really utterly at odds with China's social reality and policies of post-Mao leadership. Therefore, it's really fair to say that China has confronted this crisis of ideological legitimation and the crisis of values since the beginning of the 改革开放, or the reform of opening up in the late 1970s. So this is primarily my argument. Now we talk about the discourse owners and the dinner party, the revolution, not a dinner party, not writing essays. That's a oxymoron, because for Chairman Mao, to lead a successful revolution really depended on two armies: the army of guns, the peasant army, and the army of pens, the intellectuals. And also the Chinese intellectuals during the Deng's reform area really served as vanguard of the reform. They pioneered in the so-called emancipation of the mind movement, and they served as conscience of society during the 1980s, known as the cultural fever. Cultural fever, everybody was feverish, celebrating Chinese tradition, celebrating the Western culture, in the most festive mood of the beginning of 1980s, culminated in the bloodshed of 1989 Tiananmen incident. After that, the landscape has changed, and the Chinese intellectuals. The Chinese intellectuals, according to one of the leaders of that period, Gan Yang, the Chinese intellectuals from the 1980s to 1990s changed from so-called homo cultural to homo economicus. In other words, all the intellectuals become economic animals. That's the point that he wants to make. Of course, intellectuals, including us, we are not really cultural literatis or intelligentsia. We are the economic animals, like the rest of the society are. But also, 1990s see the rise of technocrats and engineers and the professionals who now pretty much rule China. Think about the 9 members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo of the Chinese Communist Party, pretty much everybody has an engineering background. So everybody of the ruling body of China, the Chinese Communist Party, is somehow a technocrat. Therefore, there is a shifting identities of the Chinese intellectuals from the so-called 知识分子, that's the Chinese name for the intellectuals, and the traditional 士, the gentry class, or the intelligentsia, literati, or gentry. You know, those are all loaded terms. If we talk about Chinese intellectuals as intelligentsia, you know, borrowing from the Russian of the 19th century, and also refer to the May 4th period of 1919, the early China's cultural renaissance or enlightenment, and also the literati gentry referring to the history of China. We actually see the enormous transformation or metamorphosis of Chinese intellectuals. Underneath all this, there's a deep crisis of ideological legitimation and core values, so-called core values. If you ask the ruling body of China, if they have any ruling ideology or ideologies, I would say it would be the economic developmentalism or the GDP fetish, plus a get-rich mentality of the insatiable desire for individual material wealth. For the government, for China as a nation, the most important thing is the development or the GDP as such. For individuals, is to get rich, get as much money as possible, to make as much profitable business as possible. In addition, we see the recent upsurges of nationalism in various forms. The Chinese government, the party state, promoted this kind of cultural version of nationalism, trying to create the synergy of the Confucian values of harmony and socialism with Chinese characteristics. So now, you know, the current trend is this Chinese exceptionalism. So what is really at the heart of Chinese exceptionalism is the so-called Chinese value. What is this Chinese value? This the so-called Confucian values of harmony plus socialism, Chinese version of socialism. So those are the ongoing or the current thinking in China. Now let's ask these tough questions. How can the Chinese values reconcile with, if not congruent, to the universal values of modernity? What do we mean by universal values of modernity? We mean the multi-party political democracy, politically. Socially, economically, we mean free market economy. And socially, we talk about individual freedom and middle class. And culturally, there's a diversity and pluralism. You have to think about the Chinese values, whether they are somehow incongruent with or pretty much incompatible with the so-called the universalism or universal values. On top of that, let's ask the question, because China has its Marxist tradition or socialist practice and still consider itself as socialism. Will Marxism and socialism, let alone communism, still a viable alternative to China? And that's the hard question we also have to ask ourselves. And then everybody's talking about China model or Chinese model today. If there's such a thing of China model, what is this China model different from the existing or non-existent systems models in the modern world? From the Western democracy, the East Asian autocracy, and other kinds of capitalism? We really have to ask these hard questions. My presentation will try to share with you my view, that is, we see the absence of a serious discussions of all these hard questions in China by those discourse owners, i.e. Chinese intellectuals. That's why I said there's a Chinese discourse owners, the responses and non-responses. I think the response is this carnivalesque dinner parties. Then I will talk about the four groups, how they celebrate and how they have a good time. The first group is this so-called state strategist. The second group is the politically scandalous. The third is professionals. And finally, the Weibo or microblogging opinion leaders. I have a lot of material I want to share, but I try to be quick. I will just single out a few people, in each group. The first person I want to highlight is Professor Huan Gang. He now runs a very well-known think tank in Tsinghua University. It's called 国情研究中心, literally Center for the Study of State Conditions. In English, its translation is Center for China Studies. Actually, it talks about the current state, the current conditions of the state. His approach is so-called quantitative empirical. He trained as a automation engineer in Chinese social science, in the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and he later on turned himself into a social scientist. But it's very quantitative. And also he combined this kind of American style futurology. Everybody knows Alvin Toffler, very, very well known, famous in China. Just a few points about Huan Gang. His latest book, China 2030, towards the Commonwealth of Prosperity. His argument is that China's GDP by 2030 will outnumber that of the US by 2.2 net times. Therefore, the whole world will be under the leadership of China. There will be a Commonwealth of Prosperity, or a 大同 world. The 大同 in Chinese means unified or common. As Huan Gang puts it, Americans have their values, and therefore we need our discourse power. I will talk about discourse, or 话语权, our values, and I translate our values in English as 大同 world. So we're not going to talk about modern world. We're not going to talk about the harmonious world. We better talk about 大同 world, because in less than 20 years, the whole world will be a 大同 world under Chinese leadership. This futurologist Huan Gang is making such a wonderful prophecy for China. We have to understand that Professor Huan Gang's words carry a lot of weight. It's not simply just this gibberish, things like he published bestsellings and sensationalism. Not at all. The top leaders, the 9 members of the Politburo Standing Committee really listened to his advice very carefully. Just give you one example. In the year 2004, years ago, he published this paper, The Empirical Study of the Rapid Rise of Chinese Media. And he states that Chinese media power by 2004 already surpassed Japan and other major Western countries, and rapidly narrowed its gap with the US. By his prediction, China's media power, Chinese media already outnumbers the US. It's more powerful than the United States. Domestically, his argument is domestically, but not internationally. So his advice to the top government is we really have to invest more money to boost our media power, right? His advice was really heeded by the Chinese government. In 2009, the CCP Central Committee Propaganda Department decided to allocate 45 billion RMB, or 6.6 billion US dollars, to build Chinese versions of CNN and Al Jazeera. If you see big posters in the Times Square and all that, there will be Chinese investment putting into building a new media empire of China to outnumber the US and the rest of the world. Whether or not that's true, and whether money can buy your media power, it's really up to us to decipher, to figure out. But that's Professor Hu's really recommendation and policy advice. Anyway, the second strategist, there are numerous, so I just can only point a few. Is this Professor Zhang Weiwei, who used to be a translator for Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping, when he was still working in China. Right now, he is a research fellow at the Geneva School of International Relations in Switzerland. Where it's prestigious place, I believe. With this new publication called China Shocks, 中国震撼. By the way, his English version is coming out next month by a Singaporean press. The English version of the China Shocks has changed into China Waves. W-A-V-E-S, China Waves, instead of China Shocks. Anyway, he's trying to tell us a wonderful, brilliant story of Chinese exceptionalism. Modern China is a civilizational state with immense size and length. Why China is so unique? Because its length, it's a history, it's continuous history, and its size, population, the territory, everything, it's immense in comparison to any parts of the world. And that's his general, very sweeping description of the natural features of Chinese exceptionalism. And then he goes on to elaborate on this 8 special features of China model, because the whole book is trying to promote the China model. By the way, that's a real bestseller. I'm sure he made a lot of money. Not the book that I authored years ago. That was a joke, I think. But this is really read by most of the Chinese.
In the Chinese airport, you can see that book.
Yeah, China Shocks. 中国震撼. And he listed the practical reason: strong government, prioritizing the stability, emphasizing people's livelihood, incremental reform instead of this kind of shock therapy that the predecessor of Vladimir Putin had experienced. What's his face? Yeltsin. Yeltsin. Anyway, that's not China. China is incremental, and also the differential steps of reform. It's a staggered, it's kind of step by step, very carefully designed and orchestrated, and so on, and mixed economy and opening up to the world. You think about those are all the commonplace, all the practicality, nothing really new. But this are conceived by Professor Zhang Weiwei as the most important features for China model to the world. Then he had an interesting conversation with the American historian, also a kind of public figure, Francis Fukuyama. Everybody knows Francis Fukuyama, right? He had some debate with Zhang Weiwei, and Francis Fukuyama always asked Zhang Weiwei this question: what China didn't develop is the other 2 political institutions, rule of law and formal institution political accountability. Francis Fukuyama's argument: China has no modern institutions. You have all these practices, you have all these great, brilliant ideas, but what about the institutional building? You don't seem to have that in place. And Zhang Weiwei dismissed Fukuyama by saying, "Look, your institution didn't really work. Our institution works." That's his argument. Now let's turn to the politically scandalous. I have a very interesting pair. Very unlikely bedfellows, so to speak. First one is this Wang Hui. He's named as the standard bearer of China's New Left. And, he was involved in the plagiarism, very high-profile media exposure of the plagiarism case. By the media, the academic circles, and everybody. I am not going to talk about this scholarship. If you are interested, it's quite well known. You can check everything online.
He came to college for several conferences here.
Here, right? Yeah, I'm sure he's U.S. everywhere. He has a lot of friends, a lot of supporters. He's, by the way, one of the strongest supporters. Really come from my school, from Duke, East Campus. We have lots of colleagues. Are really his friends and strongly supporting him. So that's the open letter signed by over 80 Western supporters for Wang Hui, consisting most American New Left scholars such as Gayatri Spivak, who now teaches at Columbia, and Frederick Jamison, now at Duke. Arif Dirk used to be at Duke and everywhere in the world, and so on and so forth, attesting to Wang Hui's scholarly integrity and its importance in international Asian studies. Now, I have to warn you that most of the signees of this letter are not China scholars. Most of them don't really read Chinese, I have to say. So they don't really know, but so people would ask, how can you attest to his scholarly integrity if you don't really read Chinese? You can verify he has not plagiarized. But the real thing is not, they are attesting to his integrity. They are simply making a gesture that this is not simply a case against plagiarism. This is a political warfare. This is an ideological warfare. Then I would say the case very soon escalated into an international warfare between the left and the right. I mean, China, the right is usually labeled as the liberals, or the liberals in China are labeled as right-wingers. So this is the difference, from the U.S. culture, right? So we have to be clear about that. Don't mistake that the right was the Republicans. The Chinese rightists are the Chinese liberals or the Chinese Democrats. Anyway, countering the New Left defenders, and we have a group of very famous overseas Chinese scholars in the U.S. with mostly educational political backgrounds from Taiwan, such as Lin Yusheng and Yun Shi. Both of them are the academicians of Taiwan's very prestigious Academia Sinica, and they were taught at Princeton and University of Wisconsin. And they published an open letter demanding a very serious investigation and severe punishment of the academic plagiarism against Wang Hui. So you clearly see, the two camps are engaged in this, very, very big, highly exposed by the media. Then followed by the open letter side by more than 60 Chinese university professors and public lectures calling for the immediate investigation of Wang Hui's plagiarism charge. You see the very clear dividing line. The liberals, the right wing, and the new left. It's all international. We got all the people from United States, largely from the United States and Europe and so on, involved in this case. Anyway, the second unlikely candidate for this scandalous group, you will be very surprised. This is Nobel laureate, all right? In 2001, Liu Kang was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his long-standing and non-violent struggle for fundamental human rights in China, while serving the 11-year prison terms for inciting subversion of the state. That's punishable by Chinese criminal law. Now, Liu Kang, his reputation as a human rights activist or political dissident has a very high-profile crusade in the style of the Cold War ex-Soviet bloc political dissidents in actions such as public petitions, hunger strikes, protests against the CCP single-party dictatorship, its violation of the press freedom and human rights and so on. And finally, drafting and signing the Charter 08 in the manner of the Czechoslovakia Charter 77. Very much a Cold War style, a human rights and political dissident. However, when the Nobel Prize was announced, there are several polls and studies by the media and so on, on the Chinese internet users and so on. The majority of Chinese internet users, basically under the age of 35. 80% of Chinese internet users were under the age of 35. That's the overwhelming majority of Chinese internet users are really the youngest in the world. And they really had very little, if any, idea of what Liu Kang's political and human rights activism really meant to China. And you have to understand, most of the Chinese youth are the beneficiaries of the prosperity and modernization of the last 3 decades, and becoming increasingly nationalistic. They find it very difficult to understand, let alone appreciate, the Cold War political confrontations and continued rejection of China's human rights conditions by the West. I mean, there are visible improvements, of course. You have to, anyone goes to China will find China's human rights conditions are not the conditions 30 years ago, and not as perceived by the human rights activists and the advocates in the West. So the Chinese public in general feel once again scandalized by this. Consequently, their suspicion of Western conspiracy against China was further incinerated rather than abated. So that's why I put this unlikely group, the far right and far left, together as the particularly scandalous. Okay, now I'll talk about the professionals. Those professionals are the majority of Chinese discourse owners or the academics or the cultural workers, so to speak. The majority of the Chinese academics is preoccupied with a much more practical and much less political issue: to survive and thrive in an ever-competitive and more attractive academic profession. Now being a professor is no longer a poor job. You enjoy a lot of prestige, a lot of material benefits as well, being a college professor. Now I want to quote very briefly two people again. One is Professor Qin Shaode, the ex-CCP secretary of Fudan University. Fudan University is one of China's best liberal arts university, and party secretary is usually the number one in Chinese universities. The second hand-man is usually the university president. So Professor Qin Shaode was the most powerful of Fudan University, and himself trained as a journalism scholar, and he was a chief editor of Shanghai newspaper, Jiefang Daily. And he's a great number cruncher. He quoted all the numbers, talking about the engineering 211. Those are the coded names for the big funding projects. It's called the 211工程. I translate into English as engineering 211 and engineering 985. I still can't understand the meaning of them.
So every Chinese they know that.
Yeah.
Bao, very big name.
Yeah, well, those means are big money, and 240 million yuan grant for liberal arts research in less than 5 years period. It's a big money for Fudan University only, and all those national science projects, Ministry of Education projects, philosophy, science, and Shanghai, and so on and so forth, and all this impressive inventory of the publications, the papers, the articles, the books, policy research book, and receive all that. So, this would, I hope, give us some idea of what the majority of the Chinese academic professionals are doing and are concerned with. Getting more grant money, writing more papers, publishing more in the SSCR indexed or CSSCR index. So Professor Zhao has a wonderful journal that's SSCA indexed. So a lot of Chinese want to publish there. And once you publish this journal, you will receive at least up to 100,000 yuan worth. Just for one publishing one piece. Just one piece.
I wish I were Chinese.
Yeah. So don't think being a professor
commission.
is a poor job. It has become more lucrative. Well, we have to face the fact that Chinese higher education and research pretty much remains the last bastion of the planned economy. Everything has changed in China except the education, I would say, except the education. Very much remain its practice and the institutional structures that they built from the 1950s all the way up till now. Plus they add something more to catch up with the current trend. That is the corporatization. So if you want to talk about characteristics of Chinese higher learning, we talk about the corporatization and bureaucratization. Every Chinese academic or academic administrator has a official government rank. For example, the president and party boss of a major university is ranked as vice minister level, and a dean, it's like a section leader level, and so on. With all these ranks, government ranks with go with all the privileges and benefits and restrictions. For example, you cannot fly on the business class if you are not vice minister or minister level. The deans will have to fly. We have a lot of jokes, session that I shared on our way here. But if we have time, we can share more of those jokes. But anyway. I give you another product of this bureaucratized and corporatized Chinese higher learning. That is the President Zhou Qifeng of Beijing University. Professor Zhou Qifeng would say the best education is in China. He would also say the U.S. The U.S. education is a complete mess. He said that no U.S. president knows how to respect others. Always imposes his will on others. So from this perspective, their education is truly a mess. On the contrary, the Chinese education is really the best in the world. Because why? As our conscious progress largely depends on the personnel cultivated through China's education. So the logic is very clear. China right now is the best. That's because China's education is the best. And China's education is best because Beijing University's education is best. Very honored to have a Beijing University alumni professor. So, anyway, I don't know whether Xu will agree with Professor.
No comments.
Okay. Finally, let's talk about the Weibo opinion leaders. The Weibo or the microblog is this kind of hybrid of Twitter and Facebook. With 300 million bloggers. That's the largest ever on Earth. 300 million Weibo users every day open up their Weibo, writing and reading, commenting, posting, reposting, forwarding. The function of Weibo actually is mostly recreational and entertainment. In the meantime, it tends to spread news and rumors. Most recent example is this the sudden downfall of the upstart Chongqing party boss Bo Xilai. When he was ousted from very unexpected incident. Party boss Bo Xilai was ousted. The first couple of days, the Weibo was flooded with all the messages, commentaries on Bo Xilai. And the rumors and everything was on Bo Xilai. It's about like 3 or 4 days later, everything on Bo Xilai, everything containing Bo Xilai's names disappeared from Weibo. Now, if you type Bo Xilai into the Weibo, it will never appear. It will say, due to some reasons, we're not going to show any content associated with the following name. So anyway, that's Bo Xilai. Now, talking about the Weibo opinion leaders, most of the opinion leaders, we have some ranks. We have the top 10 Weibo opinion leaders. Being an opinion leader, there are various ways to calculate Weibo opinion leader. I would say if you have over 1 million followers or fans, you can be called an opinion leader. So, of those 10 big opinion leaders, 8 of them are movie stars and TV anchors. The other remaining 2, one is a sports commentator. The last one is a real estate mogul who always publishes outrageous things on Weibo and in Chinese media. Tai Shiyi, that's the guy's name. So we have a rough idea of all the composition of the Weibo leaders. And of course, there are some serious social commentators, such as Yu Jianrong. Yu Jianrong is a professor in the Rural Research Institute at Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing. You know, a very serious a scholar studying Chinese rural problems, peasant problems, and a outspoken critique, really an outspoken critic of the Chinese government practice and the rural-urban disparity. Apart from being an outspoken critic, he is also very actively involved in social movements, such as organizing on his Weibo account initiative to share photos of children around the country who are working as street beggars in order to locate abducted children in China and reconnect them with their families. And that was a very successful campaign. And in less than a week, something like 60,000 children were located online. Weibo, those missing children or abducted children, the street beggars children. So that somehow show at least the seriousness in Weibo opinion leaders. And the other groups of the Weibo opinion leaders, I want to give you the example of Hu Xijin. Hu Xijin is the chief editor of Global Times, an offshoot of the Chinese Communist Party paper, the People's Daily. The People's Daily is a big newspaper, and they have all this smaller tabloid version of Global Times, which publishes all the sensational news, international news, with sometimes very bold language and editorials, with very provocative. And Hu Xijin also has millions of followers, almost 2 million followers or fans on his Weibo account. Always very provocative. He's. I have his. Actually, I just quoted his Weibo message day before yesterday. I actually finished the part on him yesterday, so I quoted his Weibo 2 days ago. On March 29th, Hu Xijin posted a commentary on Milton Friedman Liberty Prize. The Cato Institute, this is an American conservative think tank, is awarded to the liberal economist Mao Yushi. And this is his Weibo, I translate it in English. The prize is given to Mr. Mao by the Americans, and even more so by China. It's not simply given by the Americans, but by China, even more so by China. Because China is very strong now, so the U.S. pays special attention to the Chinese liberals. And people who are politically active but the scholarly average, like Mao, have more and more opportunities to receive Western prizes. So, it's quite sarcastic if you read it. People, it's Mao you should receive. It's like Liu Xiaobo who received the Nobel Prize. Not because they're liberal ideas, but because China is so strong. And they are really average in their professional job, but very politically active. And Hu Xijin's post immediately drew hundreds of comments, either accusing him as the lackey of the Chinese government or the running dog. All the swear words. You flooded with all the dirty words in the Weibo, or inversely attacking Mao Yushi, the recipient of the Milton Friedman Prize, as an American lackey or Chinese traitor. So that's what happens in the cyberspace of Weibo. And finally, I want to talk this very entertaining story of Han Han versus Fang Zhouzi. Han Han is a young writer. It's a pop culture icon. It's a real celebrity. He's a bestseller writer. He published 5 or 6 novels when he was a high school dropout. When he was a teenager, he quit high school and started writing novels and so on. And he was named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world last year. And he published this very popular blog with 550 million readers. It's supposed to be the largest blog ever in the world. 550 million readers, have read Han Han's blog. Reflecting on Chinese reform, the Chinese political future, political cultures, on freedom, on democracy, on political reform. Those are 3 pieces he wrote most recently, which draw huge audience. And all of a sudden, you find this Fan Zhou. Fan Zhou is a very well-known anti-fraud crusader in China, also extremely popular. He has exposed over 900 cases, high-profile Chinese celebrities, their fraud, their plagiarism, they're forging their credentials, and so on and so forth. And now Fan Zhou is accusing Han Han of ghostwriting, not plagiarism. And they had this big fight, and it's continued until this very day. And people start to forget the implications and the weight of Han Han's social criticism and political commentaries. So that's basically what they end up shifting this political debate into this highly entertainment-driven event. Anyway, do I have any conclusion? No conclusion. The dinner is over. Actually, where our dinner is going to start, right? Then what? We see the fragmentation and partition of Chinese social consciousness from the beginning of the reform. And fortunately or unfortunately, we don't really see any serious reflections as far as I'm concerned. Absence of serious reflections on the ideological crisis and the reconstruction of social values. Even though, for all the talks in the area, we have to promote Chinese software, promote Chinese core values, and so on and so forth. I hope my little sketch will give you some rough idea of the profound metamorphosis of the Chinese intellectual's identity so far. But what will happen next? I don't have any answer. All I want to say is we want to end expecting a wonderful dinner party afterwards, and then have a more serious end note by quoting this Italian thinker Antonio Gramsci. He says, pessimism of the intellect must be supplemented by optimism of the will. Thank you very much.
Please identify yourself and try to be brief, and with a question mark from my colleague, Professor Liu Kang.
Thank you, Mr. Sheng. It's really a fantastic talk. I have been a fan of yours for some time, ever since I read your Boundary 2 article. And I think the Gramsci quote is very apt for China. Let me just preface my questions with this little story. You mentioned about being very young Red Guards. We belong to the same generation, I think. I had the opportunity, my first ever visit in Beijing was in 1969 with my uncle from then East Pakistan. And we saw many Red Guards. It was very beautiful. But later my uncle mentioned that Mao had said, through an interpreter, to him and other dignitaries, that there were people in China who fight the red flag with the red flag. Mao was not naive, to say the least. And this fragmentation probably is something he could have anticipated. I have 2 questions. One is, although you have a very postmodern conclusion that we don't know anything for sure, what, in your view, is the most likely to become the dominant ideology, either through the ideological state apparatuses or through the civil society? Secondly, What kind of theoretical apparatus may be the most appropriate? In your earlier essays that I read, there is a kind of implicit Foucauldian, implicit kind of Althusserian, or quasi-Althusserian, I should say, framework. Do you still adhere to that kind of framework, or are you trying to build a new kind of theoretical framework to explain this fragmentation?
Okay, thank you. Those are really tough questions. First question, I guess, in my paper, also the presentation, you see the order of my presentation, I really focus on the state strategies. Namely Professor Liu Kang with think tanks and, also a think tank person like Professor Zhang Wei, who's kind of agent to the external propaganda campaign. Because he's sort of like a Xi and I, having appointments outside China. Although I'm not really sure if both of us want to be lured into that external propaganda. But you never know, you inadvertently will probably fall into that whole setup. Anyway, so I guess to answer your question very briefly, you see something really emerging from the state strategist, something about China model. I think that's the way to go. There will be, in my estimate, much stronger advocacy for the China exceptionalism. Why China is so exceptional. Of course, already see the sign from the so-called Chinese characteristics and so on. Whether it's socialism or capitalism or whatnot. Concerning my own conceptual framework or my critical framework, yes, you are right. In sort of trying to be a little Foucauldian or even authoritarian. I think that's how my upbringing, my education has given me. I don't see any reason giving that up, and I would still apply. I'm kind of applying that in my study here as well. Although incidentally, I'm kind of more involved in the number crunching job, hardcore social science polls, public opinion polls. The interesting thing is how you apply Foucauldian interpretation of the meaning of the polls and how to design the polls. So that aspect I find it very fascinating.
Well, I'd like to see that. Most of my own work on China is actually quantitative economics and political economy.
Most unlikely coalition, my partners that do, there's all very quantitative, posters, but that's the way to go. We need to have hard data statistics to convince, those in power in China. Hey, those are the things. But the tricky question, how you design the questions to start with. I think, I'm not trained as a social scientist, correct me if I'm wrong, you have to assume this is all objective and scientific. For my training, I'm sorry to say that, I don't really have that kind of, assumption to start with. So I'm very Foucauldian, very postmodern, if you like.
That's good.
Okay, so, okay.
So, when and where do you think Chinese CNN will establish in the United States?
Well, it's already there. It's called a CNNC. It's not CNN. It's called a CNNC. I don't know what it stands for. It's a satellite TV set up by Xinhua News Agency. It's called CNNC. It's in full operation in North America. I don't know. They seem to have negotiated with deals with local cable companies in New York State and so on. So if you are in New York, I don't know if you are in Colorado, you have the access. I don't know. Their ambition is to negotiate the deal with all the local cable companies so that they will include the signals of the CNNC in the next 5 years or so. So whenever you turn on your cable, your television, you will probably watch the CNNC. That's the Chinese version.
Is that in Chinese or?
It's in English. It's in English.
Okay, next.
So I have two questions, if you don't mind. One is, and I can't pronounce Chinese, so I apologize. The sudden fall of OCLI, do you see that as more than a political struggle? Do you think that's indicative of the debate over the future of the intellectual discourse and political model that China will have? And secondly, you have the absence of serious reflection. Do you see that as a failure of Chinese intellectualism? And in any event, what do you think that means for the next generation of Chinese intellectuals?
Let's hold on for a few more questions. Then you have a question?
Maybe I should answer this question, otherwise I will forget. Yeah. I think I'm already forgetting. Yeah, I think largely it's a political struggle, the fall of Bo Xilai. Ideologically speaking, I'm not really sure he's, all this, he's a radical cultural revolution, I think it's a sort of a political show. I don't think he is very sincere.
He had a meeting with Bo Xilai recently, just
not really recently.
a private meeting.
I've read both ways. Some people saying it's a political struggle. Some people saying he is emblematic of
He had his
emblematic
own.
of the sort of old communist side.
I don't think so. He had his own. He had his own state strategies, so to speak.
That's true.
Some of them are very good friends. I know them very well, and some of them are really sincere. I believe. One of our close friends, Cui Zhiyuan, a Chicago PhD, and he also taught at the MIT as a political scientist before he moved back to China. Sincerely believe this kind of communist, Maoist idea, and he really want to revive that idea through his lifetime. So he ended up being Bo Xilai's advisor somehow. I don't know what will happen to him. It's too soon to tell. I haven't called him yet. Yeah, he's a professor at Tsinghua University. He's going back to Tsinghua.
I don't have insight in this. I was wondering what your opinion, if there was more to it than political. It sounds like.
Yeah, in my opinion, it's mostly political struggle within the top echelon. And your second question is about the intellectual future.
Yeah, given this absence of serious response.
I guess all I want to say, I think the whole concept of intellectual, the whole identity of intellectual is in deep trouble or in deep transition, metamorphosis. Do we still want to think about a real intellectual as such in China or difference as such? I seriously doubt. What I see is now, I don't really see, people think, they think themselves as intellectuals subconsciously, and what they do don't really come up with what you would normally expect from the intellectual. So I guess I may sound a little more pessimistic, but again, that's the way I see it.
Let's collect several questions. Stop. Yeah.
You mentioned that you're a Foucauldian, so I have a question related to that. You partly already answered it, but let me put it. So you said that there's an increasing politicization of academics in China. Every top academic has a position in the political party. So in a way, there is a direct connection between whatever knowledge is being produced within China and the politics, maybe the power behind it. So, or the reciprocal relationship between the two. Do you think that's a very dangerous track? I mean, it has a dangerous consequence both within China as well as the policy that China has for outside China. I mean,
Okay.
How do you see that? Is there a way out of that situation,
Okay.
or?
I got it. All right.
More questions here? Okay.
I might miss the part, but I really want, because you mentioned that the absence of a serious reflection on the real crisis of social values. So what is, in your opinion, the core of the real crisis of social values that China, the society, may be really facing right now? Because at the beginning you mentioned the strategist. It's more about like how the strategists make this discourse, maybe their audience is more to outsider, other powers I'm not sure whether their audience also, main audience is also for their, the people in China, about like, you say the Chinese exceptionalism or the 大同世界, this kind. Is that kind of a real problem for the crisis of social values you mentioned?
Okay, any more questions? Okay, so now.
Yeah, well, the first question, I talked about the corporatization and bureaucratization. I guess bureaucratization is politicization. Well, not quite. You know, I would think it's kind of a political trend that has become kind of dominant among Chinese academics. You know, the bureaucratization reminds them of the command economy, the planned economy, how they distribute the power and share the power academically through a redistribution of wealth, the funds, the grants. So that's why the corporatization applies. The corporatization in China is Chinese characteristics. There's not much private funding, not much private money involved in this corporatization. And corporate China, we're talking about a state corporate. I mean, I would tend to think that the largest corporate in the world is Chinese Communist Party. So I would even call it CCP.com. Well, anyway, I mean, let's face it. Anyway, your question. I want to go back to this slide. The real issues. I think we have to think about. Do we really want to celebrate? So far, I think it's too early to celebrate this Chinese exceptionalism and Chinese model, China model, Chinese values. But we never forget that Chinese values and Chinese models make absolutely no sense if we don't really want to think about modernity. The modernity is not simply conceptual, but a real condition. And modernity, what do we mean by modernity? It's all Western-based. It started from the West. You cannot resist. You cannot deny that. So we really have to face this Western-based or Western-centered or Eurocentric modernity or universalism. And what is the Chinese answer to that? I don't really see any serious answers. Even the debate about universalism was somehow suppressed in China. 2 years ago, they say, no, hey, we don't want to talk about universalism. No more talk about universalism in public.
Okay, with that note, before we thank Professor Liu, I want to make some announcement for our future events. We have a speaker coming next week from U.S. State Department African Bureau talking about China-Africa-U.S. relationship. Then the week after, we have a speaker, congressman from Illinois. He is Foreign Affairs Committee's Asian Pacific Subcommittee chairman. So he will be here, talk about Asian Pacific, whatever. I don't know this politicians. And then on April 17th, we have Dan Wright. He was the former senior advisor and director of China division at the U.S. Treasury Department, in charge of U.S.-China economic and strategic dialogue. He now is a consulting company, as all those former government officials. That's all they can do. Consulting in Washington. So he will come to talk about China-U.S. Economic relationship. Then we have our AU conference on May 4th and 5th. This year, the conference is co-hosted with Zhejiang University and also with Sahara Institute in Beijing. We have a delegation from China, and we have speakers from Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, and India. So I hope you can sign up for our conference. And the last event for this quarter is from Taiwan. We have former chairman of the Policy Planning and Design from Taiwan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So he will come in May, talk about China-Taiwan issues. So please follow our email announcements. And if you are not on our email list, we have a form and something behind and back. You can sign up. Finally, thank you all for coming, and also please join me to thank Professor Liu for such wonderful